Hey, church family, thank you for joining us for today's daily connection video. We are talking about being sure in our relationship with Jesus this week. I think we maybe have gotten off a little bit over the last few weeks, but we're back on track, following along here in our devotional book. And today we're going to be walking through one of the most powerful chapters of the Bible, in a section of scripture that really tells us quite a bit about Christ and his work within our own lives. And that is John chapter 1. And this week, looking at verses 10 through 14. And so, man, you can go ahead and earmark that for the week as we walk through that again, talking about being sure in our relationship with Jesus. And part of being sure in our relationship with Jesus is knowing that we have one, seeing him, right? Recognizing him and recognizing how he works. I think that a lot of times people lose their confidence in their relationship with Christ because they don't see him doing anything. I've even heard people say, what is Christ doing? I don't see him working in my life. How can I tell he's real if he's not doing anything? And I think there are times when we're definitely blinded by the world and we don't recognize the many ways that Christ is working. So that's really what I want us to look at today. And John, he addresses this in verse 10 out of chapter 1 of his gospel. He says, he was in the world and the world was created through him, and yet the world did not recognize him. And isn't that ironic that although Christ, who was there at creation, right? He was there in the very beginning. Even though he was there in creation, even though he was a part of creation, Colossians says he holds all things together. All things are created for him and by him. Even though Christ was a part of creation, was there in creation, holds creation together, he is not recognized by creation. Even though all throughout the Old Testament he's prophesied, even though the Jewish people should have known exactly who he was whenever he came, because it was no secret for forever since the beginning of their people's existence as God's people. Christ has been talked about, the Messiah has been talked about, yet they did not see him because they were looking for something different. They were looking for something more grand, or at least their definition of grand. They were blinded by the world. They were blinded by the world's standard of a Messiah, which they thought was much higher than who Jesus was. But you and I know that Jesus was much higher than that standard. They were looking for a king who was going to come and rule in an earthly manner. They were looking for someone to come and overthrow the government. They're looking for someone to come and make them a great earthly kingdom, a great earthly people. But that's not why Christ came. Christ came on a much greater scale. He came to free them from the bondage of sin, not the bondage of the Romans. He came to create an eternal kingdom, an eternal dominion, and to have them be a part of that. And so when he came, because he didn't meet the standards, the worldly standards that they had for him, they didn't recognize him and all that he was doing. They had no idea who he was. And we do the same thing, don't we? We create our own expectations or standards for who Christ is and what he should do. And we look only for those specific things when Scripture's clear that Christ takes our expectations and he blows them out of the water. I think a lot of times we are so focused on Christ doing what we want him to do that we miss all that Christ is actually doing. We just pray about something and hope that it happens and say that if it does happen, that Christ is working. When there may be 8 other things that are happening around that circumstance, is all the work of Christ. Or many times, great things happening, we attribute them to the work of man, to the work of governments, to the work of doctors. Let us not forget who gives men and governments and doctors their power and their wisdom and their knowledge. Those things come from the Lord, and so that is Jesus at work. Let us not forget all the great things that Christ does for us on a regular basis. You and I, man, we have got to have our eyes open and our hearts open, seeking and looking for the things that Christ is doing in your life and in my life. Our author gives us a couple of questions that we can look at here. The first question, why did people fail to recognize Jesus when he came to earth? And we mentioned this, but if you remember, man, take a moment, think through that. Why do you think, or why did these people fail to recognize who Jesus was? Again, they're looking for an earthly Messiah, an earthly king. Christ came for something much greater than that. And then the second question I think is very relevant for you and for me, something that we need to pay attention to. Why do people miss seeing Jesus today? What blinds them from seeing who Jesus is? What blinds you from seeing who Jesus is and what he's doing? Church family, I hope that you will think through that critically, that you'll work through that, you'll recognize what those things are, and you'll pray and give them to the Lord and ask him to open your eyes and open your heart to all the work that he's doing all around you. And as you do that, church family, we want you to know that we love you and we're praying for you.